Hello my friends, welcome to another night of Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward, your host, also from Warm Pages. Before we begin, is there a place from your past, a town, a street, a little shop, that you still think about fondly? Share a memory with us in the comments. I treasure reading them, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, relax. Our story is ready to unfold. Chapter 1. The Bitter Wind and the Bad Auditor. The rain came down in sheets across the Highland coast, driven by a bitter wind that seemed to come straight from the Arctic. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood at the window of his kitchen in the police station at Lochdu, pronounced Lochdu by those who knew better than to anglicise everything Scottish, and watched the downpour turn the surrounding moors into a landscape of grey misery. It was the sort of day that made a man grateful for a roof over his head, a peat fire in the grate, and absolutely no reason whatsoever to venture outside. Hamish was very good at finding reasons not to venture outside. In fact, his reputation for idleness was so well established in the village that the locals had long since stopped expecting him to do much in the way of actual police work. This suited Hamish perfectly. He had no desire for promotion, no ambition to transfer to the grim industrial town of Strathbane, and absolutely no interest in disturbing the peaceful equilibrium of his beloved village. He turned from the window and looked down at his dog, Lugs, a large, ungainly animal with a fringe of hair hanging over his eyes and the patience of a saint. Beside Lugs sat Sonzi, the wildcat that Hamish had somehow domesticated. This was an achievement that still surprised him on a daily basis. Both animals were staring at him with the intensity of creatures who knew that dinner was overdue. Right, thought Hamish. Feed the beasts, check on the sheep, and then settle in for a quiet evening with a good book. Perfect. He had just finished filling their bowls when there was a knock at the door. Hamish sighed. Visitors on a day like this were never bringing good news. He opened the door to find Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, standing on his doorstep with her umbrella turned inside out by the wind. "Hamish," she boomed in her usual forthright manner, "you'll want to get down to the pub. There's a right nasty piece of work from London causing trouble." Hamish's heart sank. Can it not wait until the rain stops? Mrs. Wellington gave him a look that would have withered lesser men. The rain's not stopping until next week if the forecast is right. This man is threatening to close Strathbane Bridge to agricultural traffic. He says it's unsafe. Half the crofters in the area depend on that crossing. Hamish pulled on his regulation waterproof jacket with reluctance. "What's his name?" "Julian Vane," said Mrs. Wellington with distaste. "Some sort of corporate auditor. Come up to verify the safety in Landies, or so he says. More like he's come up to make everyone's life a misery." The pub, when Hamish arrived 10 minutes later, was packed with angry villagers despite the early hour. At the centre of the commotion stood Julian Vane, and Hamish disliked him on sight. Vane was a tall man in his early 50s, expensively dressed in country wear that looked as though it had never seen actual country. His face was red with either drink or self-righteousness, probably both, and his voice carried the particular brand of arrogance that came from a lifetime of never being told no. These so-called historic structures, Vane was saying loudly to no one in particular, are a danger to the public. The bridge was built in the 18th century. It was never designed for modern agricultural machinery. I have every right to recommend closure pending a full structural survey. Archie McLean, the local fisherman, was on his feet. That bridge has carried farm equipment for 200 years without a problem. You close it and you cut off half the crofts in the area. "That's not my concern," said Vane dismissively. "Safety is paramount. If your business model depends on an unsafe crossing, perhaps you need a better business model." The pub erupted. Hamish could see that it would take very little for the situation to turn ugly. He was about to intervene when a gentle voice cut through the noise. "Gentlemen, please." Everyone turned to look at Mrs. Morag Menzies, the village librarian. She was a small, softly spoken woman in her late 50s, with greying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and the kind of gentle demeanour that made people instinctively lower their voices in her presence. "Mr. Vane," she said with a sweet smile, "perhaps I could help. I'm the local heritage volunteer. I have access to all the historical records regarding the bridge, including the original construction documents and maintenance logs. I'd be happy to provide you with copies. I'm sure once you see the documentation, you'll find that the bridge has been regularly inspected and maintained to the highest standards." Vane looked at her with barely concealed contempt. "I don't need historical documents, madam. I need a structural engineer's report, and until I get one that satisfies me, I'm recommending that the bridge be closed to all heavy agricultural traffic." Morag's smile never wavered. "Of course, Mr. Vane. I only thought it might be helpful. Can I get you some tea? You must be tired after your journey from London." She moved away to the bar, signalling to the publican, and began preparing a tray of tea things. Hamish watched her carefully. There was something about her studied politeness that struck him as odd, though he couldn't put his finger on what. The afternoon wore on. Vane continued to insult the locals with breathtaking obliviousness, making increasingly specific threats about legal trespassing notices and land registry investigations. Morag Menzies moved quietly among the villagers, serving tea, offering calming words, and generally acting as a peacemaker. By the time Hamish left the pub, the rain had intensified to a proper Highland deluge. He trudged back to the police station, his mood as dark as the sky. He found a basket waiting on his doorstep covered with a tea towel. Inside were fresh scones, still warm, and a note in neat handwriting. "Dear Constable Macbeth, I thought you might appreciate these on such a miserable day. Best wishes, Morag Menzies." Hamish took the basket inside and shared a scone with Lugs and Sonsy. The scones were excellent, light and buttery. Mrs. Meanies was a kind woman, he thought, one of the good ones. He settled into his armchair by the fire, listening to the wind howl outside. Somewhere out there, Julian Vane was no doubt making more enemies. Hamish had seen his type before, the sort of man who went through life creating chaos and never seemed to suffer any consequences for it. But the Highlands had a way of dealing with troublemakers, thought Hamish drowsily. Usually it involved everyone simply ignoring them until they got bored and went away. He had no idea how wrong he was. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the darkness someone was making very different plans for Mr. Julian Vane. Chapter 2. Death at the Crossing. Hamish woke to silence, which was unusual enough to be alarming. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, leaving behind that peculiar Highland stillness that came after a storm. He lay in bed for a moment, listening to Lug snoring gently at the foot of the bed and Sonsy purring somewhere near his feet. Then the phone rang. It was barely 7 in the morning, and phone calls at that hour were never good news. Hamish reached for the receiver with a sense of foreboding. "Hamish, it's Archie McLean. You better get down to Strathbane Bridge right away." Archie's voice was shaking, which was odd for a man who spent his days hauling fishing nets in all weathers. "What's happened?" "It's that London fellow, Julian Vane. He's dead." 20 minutes later, Hamish was standing on the rocky banks beneath Strathbane Bridge, looking down at what had once been Julian Vane. The body lay sprawled among the stones, and even from a distance, Hamish could see the unnatural angle of the head, the dark stain of blood on the rocks. Archie stood a few feet away, his face pale. "I was heading out early to check the lobster pots," he said. "Saw him lying there from the bridge. Knew right away he was dead." Hamish moved closer, careful not to disturb the scene. The body was cold, stiff with rigor mortis. Vane had been dead for several hours at least. But it was the wound that caught Hamish's attention. The skull had been crushed, and lying beside the body, partially hidden by seaweed and stones, was the murder weapon. It was an antique cast-iron peat cutter, heavy and brutal, the sort of implement that had been used for generations to cut blocks of peat from the Highland bogs. Hamish recognised it immediately. It had been part of the heritage display outside the library, one of several historical farming tools that Morag Menzies had carefully labelled and arranged for tourists. He straightened up and looked at the bridge itself. The stone structure loomed above them, solid and ancient. But something was off. Hamish climbed up the embankment and examined the bridge more carefully. Several of the old stone markers along the edge had been disturbed, recently by the look of it. The moss had been scraped away, and there were fresh scratches in the stone. This was no accident, no drunken fall in the darkness. Someone had lured or followed Vane to this spot and struck him down with deliberate force. Here, Hamish pulled out his mobile phone with a heavy heart. He was going to have to call Strathbane, which meant he was going to have to deal with Detective Chief Inspector Blair. 2 hours later, the piece of Lochdoub had been thoroughly shattered by the arrival of what seemed like half the Strathbane police force. Blair emerged from his car like a malevolent toad, his face already red with anticipation. "Right then, Macbeth," he bellowed. "Don't just stand there looking useless. What have you done to secure the scene?" "I've secured it, sir," said Hamish mildly. "Nobody's been near it except Archie McLean, who found the body." Blair waddled down to the riverbank, breathing heavily. His second-in-command, Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson, followed at a more reasonable pace, giving Hamish a sympathetic look. The forensics team arrived and began their work. Hamish stood back and watched, making mental notes. The placement of the body suggested that Vane had been standing near the bridge support when he was struck from behind. There were no signs of a struggle, which meant either the killer had taken him completely by surprise, or Vane had felt safe enough with his attacker to turn his back. A small crowd had gathered on the bridge above, villagers drawn by the police presence. Hamish spotted Mrs. Menzies among them, her hand pressed to her mouth, her face shocked and pale. She hurried down when she saw him. "Constable Macbeth, this is terrible, just terrible. Poor Mr. Vane." Hamish thought that poor was not the adjective most people would have chosen, but he kept that observation to himself. "Mrs. Menzies, did you see or hear anything unusual last night?" She shook her head. "I was at home all evening. The rain was so heavy I didn't even go out to post a letter." She looked down at the scene below, where the white-suited forensics team was photographing the body. "Is that one of the tools from the heritage display?" "Aye," said Hamish. "The peat cutter." Her hand fluttered to her throat. "Oh dear. Oh, that's dreadful. Someone must have taken it yesterday. I didn't notice it was missing, but then I closed the library early because of the weather." Blair came puffing back up the embankment. "Right," he announced to anyone who would listen. "This is clearly murder, and I'll tell you who did it. One of these bloody crofters that Vane was threatening yesterday. Anderson, get me a list of everyone who had an argument with the victim." Before Jimmy could respond, Mrs. Menzies stepped forward. "I can help with that, Chief Inspector." She reached into her handbag and produced a small notebook. "I keep track of everything that happens in the village for the historical records. I made a note yesterday of everyone Mr. Vane spoke to at the pub." She handed the notebook to Blair, who looked at her with something approaching gratitude. "Very efficient, Mrs. Menzies. I also brought coffee and sandwiches," she said, gesturing to a large basket she'd set down nearby. "I thought your men might need refreshment. It's cold work standing about in this weather." Blair's expression softened considerably. Very thoughtful indeed. Hamish watched as Morag distributed thermoses of hot coffee to the Strathbane detectives. There was something almost theatrical about her helpfulness, he thought. But then she was the sort of woman who thrived on being useful. The village would be lost without her. Jimmy Anderson appeared at Hamish's elbow. "Your DCI seems quite taken with the librarian." "She's a kind woman," said Hamish. "She's also given him a complete list of suspects," said Jimmy. "All locals. Blair's going to have a field day with this." Hamish felt a familiar sense of dread. Blair loved nothing more than bullying Highland villagers, and now he had the perfect excuse. The forensics team finished their preliminary examination, and the body was removed to the mortuary van. Blair gathered his detectives together. "Right," he said, consulting Mrs. Menzies' notebook. "We'll start with Archie McLean, since he found the body. Always suspicious, that. Yeah, then we'll work through this list. Every man that Vane threatened yesterday is a suspect. We'll have this wrapped up by tea time." Hamish doubted that very much. Murder in the Highlands was rarely simple, and this one had complications written all over it. The disturbed stone markers, the carefully chosen weapon, the calculated nature of the ambush, All suggested a killer who had planned this carefully. As the police vehicles began to disperse, Hamish walked slowly back along the bridge. He paused at the spot where the markers had been disturbed and crouched down to examine them more closely. Someone had been looking for something, or perhaps checking something. But what? Constable Macbeth. He looked up to find Mrs. Menzies standing beside him, her empty basket over her arm. "I just wanted to say," she said quietly, "if there's anything I can do to help with your investigation, you only have to ask. I know this village and its people better than anyone. That's kind of you, Mrs. Menzies." She smiled her gentle smile. "We must all do what we can. Poor Mr. Vane may not have been a pleasant man, but nobody deserves to die like that." She walked away, her sensible shoes clicking on the stone bridge. Hamish watched her go, a vague unease stirring in the back of his mind. But he dismissed it. Mrs. Menzies was one of the good ones, always had been. He turned his attention back to the bridge. Somewhere in this ancient structure, in the pattern of disturbed stones and the choice of the weapon, was the key to understanding why Julian Vane had died. And Hamish Macbeth, despite his reputation for laziness, had every intention of finding it before Blair arrested the wrong person. Chapter 3, Sifting the Highland Gossip. Hamish knew from long experience that Blair's idea of a thorough investigation consisted of bullying the first available suspect until they confessed to something, anything, just to make him go away. He also knew that the innocent crofters and fishermen of Lochdoub would be no match for Blair's particular brand of aggressive incompetence, which meant Hamish would have to conduct his own investigation, quietly and without official sanction, before Blair could do any real damage. He started, as he always did, with the village gossips. The Curry twins, Nessie and Jessie, lived in a neat cottage overlooking the harbour. They were spinsters in their 70s, identical in appearance and possessed of the annoying habit of repeating each other's sentences. They also knew everything that happened in Lochdoub, usually before it actually happened. Hamish found them in their front parlour, knitting identical cardigans in identical shades of purple. "Constable Macbeth," said Nessie. "We've been expecting you." "Expecting you," echoed Jessie. "I thought you might have," said Hamish, settling into the chair they indicated. "You'll have heard about Mr. Vane." "Terrible business," said Nessie, her knitting needles clicking steadily. "Terrible," agreed Jessie. "Did either of you see anything unusual yesterday, before the rain got too heavy?" The twins exchanged a look, the sort of wordless communication that came from a lifetime of sharing the same thoughts. "We saw Mr. Vane," said Nessie slowly, "down by the harbour in the afternoon." "By the harbour?" confirmed Jessie. "Was he alone?" Another exchanged glance. "No," said Nessie. "He was arguing with a young man. Well-dressed he was. Not from around here." "Not from here," said Jessie. "City clothes. Did you hear what they were arguing about?" Nessie shook her head. "We were too far away. But it looked heated, it did. The young man kept pointing his finger at Mr. Vane, and Mr. Vane was waving his arms about." "Waving his arms," repeated Jessie. "What time was this?" "Around 3 o'clock," said Nessie. "Just before the rain started proper." "Started proper," agreed Jessie. Hamish made a mental note. A mysterious young man from the city, arguing with Vane hours before his death. That was interesting. He left the Curry cottage and drove out to see Angus MacDonald, who lived in a tumble-down croft on the outskirts of the village. Angus claimed to be a seer gifted with the second sight. Hamish knew he was nothing of the sort, but the old man had an uncanny knack for knowing things he shouldn't, mainly because he maintained a network of gossips that would have made Meesix jealous. Angus was sitting outside his cottage despite the cold, smoking his pipe and looking enigmatic. "I've been waiting for ye, Hamish," he said in his wheezy voice. "Have you now?" said Hamish, refusing to be impressed. "Aye, I saw it in a dream. A red-faced man from the city, struck down by the sins of his past. The bridge will run red with blood before the truth comes out." "Very poetic," said Hamish. "Now what have you actually heard?" Angus cackled. "You have no faith, Hamish Macbeth. But I'll tell you this. That Vane fellow was not what he seemed. He was making inquiries about the old land deeds, asking questions about properties that changed hands 40, 50 years ago. Making people nervous, he was. What sort of questions? Questions about who owned what, and whether the ownership was legal. Stirring up old troubles, better left buried. Do you know if he spoke to anyone in particular about these deeds? Angus puffed on his pipe. He was seen going into the library more than once, spent hours looking through the old records with Mrs. Menzies helping him. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to think he'd found it. Hamish filed that away. Did you see him yesterday? No, but my cousin's boy works at the hotel in Strathbane. Says a well-dressed young man came in asking directions to Loughdoob around midday. Seemed agitated, he did. Another mention of the mysterious young man. Hamish thanked Angus and headed back to the village, but he made a detour to the hotel bar in Strathbane on the way. The hotel was one of those grim establishments that catered to travelling salesmen and people with nowhere better to be. Hamish found the barman polishing glasses with the resigned air of a man who had long since given up on life being interesting. "I'm looking for information about a guest yesterday," said Hamish, showing his identification. "Young man, well-dressed, city type. Would have come in around midday." The barman brightened slightly. "Oh, I remember him. Asked for directions to Loughdoob. Seemed in a right state about something. Did he give a name?" The barman shook his head. Didn't stay for a drink, just got his directions and left. But he dropped his wallet getting his keys out. I picked it up for him. Saw his driver's licence. Name was Vane. And Hamish felt a small thrill of satisfaction. Vane. Same surname as the victim. Family, perhaps. "Did you happen to notice his first name?" "Callum," said the barman. "I remember because my nephew's called Callum." Hamish bought the man a drink and left. A relative arriving in the village on the day of the murder, arguing with the victim hours before his death. That was very interesting indeed. He needed to see the autopsy report and get access to whatever evidence Blair's team had collected, which meant he needed Jimmy Anderson. Fortunately, Jimmy was one of the few decent detectives in Strathbane, and he had a weakness for good whisky. Hamish found him at the police station, looking harassed. "Blair's got Archie McLean in the interview room," Jimmy said. "Been going at him for 2 hours. The poor man's terrified. Archie didn't do it," said Hamish. "Probably not," agreed Jimmy. "But he's got big feet, and the boot prints near the bridge match his Wellingtons. Blair thinks that's enough for an arrest." Hamish produced a bottle of single malt from his jacket pocket. "I don't suppose you've had a chance to look at the preliminary autopsy findings?" Jimmy's eyes lit up at the sight of the whisky. I might have glanced at them. They retreated to Jimmy's office, and Hamish poured 2 generous measures while Jimmy pulled out a file folder. "Death by blunt force trauma," Jimmy read. "Single blow to the back of the skull, delivered with considerable force. The weapon was definitely that peat cutter. Time of death estimated between 8 and 10 last night." "Before the rain got really heavy," said Hamish. "The killer would have been soaked." "Aye. But half the village was soaked yesterday. Everyone was in and out of the pub." Jimmy took a sip of whisky and sighed with satisfaction. "There's something else. We found traces of old paper fibres on the victim's jacket. Archival quality, the lab says. The sort used for preserving historical documents. From the library, perhaps. Could be. And there's this." Jimmy pulled out a photograph, found it in Vane's jacket pocket. "Looks like an old property deed, but it's been torn. Just a corner of it." Hamish examined the photograph. The fragment showed part of a date, 18-something, and what looked like a signature. "Did Blair see this?" "Blair never looks at evidence closely enough," said Jimmy. "He's already decided Archie did it. Everything else is just paperwork. Can I get a copy of this?" Jimmy slid it across the desk. Just don't tell anyone where you got it. Blair's already suspicious about why you're not jumping to conclusions like he is." Hamish pocketed the photograph and topped up Jimmy's glass. "What do you know about Vane's background?" "Not much. He was staying at that fancy rental cottage on the point. Drove up from London 3 days ago. No wife, no family that we know of. He worked for some big auditing firm, verifying land sales and property transfers. Did he have any enemies in London? If he did, they didn't follow him to Lockdoob, said Jimmy. No, this feels local to me. Someone here had a reason to want him dead. Hamish thought about the mysterious Callum Vane, about the old land deeds, about the fragment of archival paper. The pieces were there, but they didn't quite fit together yet. One more thing, he said. And did you find Vane's mobile phone? No, said Jimmy. It wasn't on the body. Either the killer took it, or it's somewhere at the bottom of the river. Hamish drove back to Lockdoob as the afternoon light began to fade. The village looked peaceful in the gathering dusk, smoke rising from chimneys, lights coming on in cottage windows. It was the sort of scene that belonged on a postcard, all Highland charm and tranquillity. But underneath that peaceful surface, Hamish knew there were secrets. Old grievances, hidden connections, the sort of tangled history that every small village accumulated over the centuries. And somewhere in that tangle was a killer who had struck down Julian Vane with cold deliberation and then vanished back into the fabric of village life. Hamish parked outside the police station and sat for a moment thinking. He needed to find Callum Vane. He needed to know more about those old land deeds, and he needed to do it all before Blair arrested half the village. Luggs greeted him at the door with his usual enthusiasm, and Sonsi wound round his ankles, purring. Hamish fed them both and made himself a cup of tea. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow he would start unravelling this properly. Tonight, he would think. And as he sat by his fire, the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to arrange themselves in his mind. Chapter 4, The Blackmailer's Ledger. The autopsy report arrived the next morning by courier, and Hamish read it over breakfast while Luggs sat at his feet hoping for dropped toast. The findings confirmed what he already knew. Julian Vane had died from a single, powerful blow to the back of the skull. The angle of impact suggested the killer had been standing slightly above him, possibly on the bridge itself, while Vane stood near the support beam below. What interested Hamish more was the toxicology report. Vane had consumed a substantial amount of whiskey in the hours before his death, but not enough to significantly impair his judgment. He would have been alert enough to recognise his attacker, assuming he'd seen them coming. The report also noted bruising on Vane's forearms, recent but not connected to the fatal injury. Defence wounds, perhaps, or evidence of the argument the Curry twins had witnessed. Hamish finished his tea and made a decision. He needed to search Vane's rental cottage, and he needed to do it before Blair thought of the same thing. The cottage sat on a promontory overlooking the sea, one of those expensive holiday lets that city people rented when they wanted to experience authentic Highland life without actually experiencing any discomfort. Hamish let himself in with the key he'd obtained from the letting agency, citing official police business. The interior was exactly what he'd expected. Expensive furnishings, a well-stocked kitchen that showed no signs of use, and everywhere the evidence of a man who travelled for business. Laptop computer on the desk, briefcase beside it, clothes hung precisely in the wardrobe. Hamish searched methodically, starting with the obvious places. The briefcase yielded business cards, expense receipts, and a folder full of property surveys and land registry documents relating to Strathbane Bridge. Nothing particularly illuminating. The laptop was password protected, and Hamish was debating whether to take it when he noticed something odd about the bookshelf. One of the books, a leather-bound volume that looked like it belonged in a library rather than a holiday cottage, sat slightly proud of the others. He pulled it out and found it wasn't a book at all, but a hollow container designed to look like one. Behind it, set into the wall, was a small safe. Hamish stood back and considered. He could call Blair and do this officially, which would take hours and probably result in Blair contaminating whatever evidence might be inside. Or he could do what any sensible Highland policeman would do and solve the problem himself. The safe was electronic, requiring a 4-digit code. Hamish tried the obvious combinations first. Vane's birth year, based on the dates in his briefcase. The current year. Simple sequences like 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing worked. He sat down and thought about Julian Vane, a man who used his position to threaten and intimidate, a man who collected secrets. What would such a man use as a password? On a hunch, Hamish tried the numbers from the torn property deed fragment, the date he'd seen in the photograph, 18-something. He tried various combinations until one finally worked, 1847. The safe clicked open. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, the sort of thing an accountant might have used 50 years ago. Hamish pulled it out carefully and opened it to the first page. What he found made his blood run cold. The ledger was a catalogue of secrets, meticulously organised by name and location. Each entry detailed a piece of damaging information about a resident of Lochdubh or the surrounding area, along with dates and documentary evidence. Property disputes that had never been properly resolved. Land transfers that skirted the edges of legality. Ancient grievances that had been quietly buried for decades. Hamish recognised many of the names. Archie McLean's entry noted an unregistered land sale from 30 years ago, a small plot that Archie had bought from a cousin, without bothering with the proper paperwork. Doctor. Brodie had an entry about a medical oversight from his early days in practice. Nothing serious, but enough to cause trouble if reported to the medical board. There were dozens of entries, each one a lever that Vane could have used to extract money or cooperation. The man hadn't just been an auditor. He'd been a blackmailer using his access to historical records to dig up dirt on innocent people. Hamish photographed each page with his mobile phone, then carefully replaced the ledger and locked the safe. He pocketed the fake book and left the cottage exactly as he'd found it. This changed everything. Vane hadn't just made himself unpopular by threatening to close the bridge. He'd been actively extorting the villagers, or planning to. Any one of the people in that ledger might have had a reason to kill him. Back at the police station, Hamish spread the photographs across his desk and studied them. The question was which of these secrets was worth killing for. He was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Menzies stood on the doorstep carrying another basket. "Good morning, Constable," she said brightly. "I brought you some fresh bannocks. I thought you might be too busy with the investigation to cook properly." "That's very kind," said Hamish, accepting the basket. He noticed she was trying to peer past him into the office. "Any progress?" she asked. "Such a terrible thing for the village. Everyone's so upset." "We're following several leads," said Hamish carefully. "I do hope you find whoever did it soon," she said. "Chief Inspector Blair seems quite convinced it was poor Archie, but that can't be right. Archie wouldn't hurt a fly. What makes you so certain?" Morag smiled. "I've known Archie since he was a boy. He talks a good fight when he's had a few drams, but he's gentle at heart. Besides, his wife had him on a very short leash that night. She told me herself he was hiding in the cellar by 7:30. "That's a very precise time," said Hamish. "Well, she came to the library at closing time around 7 looking for him. Said she'd give him what for when she found him." She laughed gently. Poor Archie. Being married to that woman is punishment enough without being accused of murder. She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, I nearly forgot. I found something that might interest you." It was tucked inside one of the old property registers that Mr. Vane was looking through. She reached into her handbag and produced a small piece of paper, folded and yellowed with age. It appears to be a receipt of some kind. 1847. I thought it might be connected to whatever Mr. Vane was researching. Hamish took the paper carefully. 1847. The same year as the safe combination. That couldn't be a coincidence. The receipt was for a land transaction, the sale of property near Strathbane Bridge. The names were faded, but he could make out enough to see that it involved a family called Menzies. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked. "Tucked into the property register for that year," said Morag. "Mr. Vane had left several books pulled out. I was reshelving them and it just fell out. I thought you should have it, in case it's important." "Thank you, Mrs. Menzies. This is very helpful." After she left, Hamish sat for a long time, looking at the receipt. Menzies. It was a common enough name in the Highlands, but still. He pulled out his laptop and started searching historical records. 2 hours later, he had his answer. The land transaction involved the sale of a significant property near what was now Strathbane Bridge. The seller had been a man named Malcolm Menzies, who had declared bankruptcy in 1848, just a year after the sale. Further digging revealed that the buyer had been a London business consortium that had later been exposed as fraudulent. The Menzies family had lost everything, and Malcolm Menzies had died by his own hand shortly afterward. Hamish sat back, his mind racing. It could be a coincidence. Menzies was a common name. But Mrs. Morag Menzies had spent years as the village historian, with access to all the old records. If she'd discovered that her own family had been cheated out of their land, that the bridge now stood on property that should have been her inheritance, what would she do? More importantly, if Julian Vane had discovered the same thing and threatened to expose some hidden aspect of it, what would she do then? Hamish looked at the photographs of the ledger pages. He needed to find Morag Menzies' entry, if there was one. He found it near the end, and what he read made his blood run cold. Vane had discovered that Malcolm Menzies, before his death, had hidden certain family artefacts near the bridge to keep them from his creditors. Small items of value, jewellery perhaps, that had never been recovered. And he'd discovered that Morag Menzies, the helpful village librarian, was Malcolm's great-great-granddaughter. Vane's note suggested he'd been planning to confront her, to offer her a choice. Pay him to keep quiet about the theft, technically committed by her ancestor but still legally problematic, or he'd report it and destroy her reputation in the village she'd lived in all her life. Hamish closed the file and stared out the window. Sweet, helpful Morag Menzies, always ready with tea and sympathy, always eager to assist with the investigation, always one step ahead, providing convenient alibis for others while remaining above suspicion herself. He thought about the antique peat cutter, taken from the heritage display she maintained, about her intimate knowledge of the bridge and its history, about her access to archival materials that would explain the paper fibres found on Vane's jacket. The pieces were falling into place, but Hamish needed proof, and he needed to be very, very careful about how he proceeded. Because if he was right, then Morag Menzies was a killer who had hidden in plain sight, protected by her reputation for kindness. And the most dangerous killers, Hamish knew, were the ones nobody suspected. Chapter 5. Expanding the Suspect Pool. Hamish spent the rest of the morning wrestling with his suspicions about Morag Menzies. On one hand, the evidence was compelling. The family connection to the land, the access to the murder weapon, the intimate knowledge of the bridge and its history. On the other hand, this was Mrs. Menzies, the woman who brought scones to shut-ins and organised the village fete every summer. The idea of her crushing a man's skull with a peat cutter seemed absurd. But then, Hamish had learned long ago that murderers rarely looked like murderers. They looked like accountants and librarians and the nice lady who lived next door. He was saved from further brooding by the arrival of Jimmy Anderson, who looked harassed and in need of whiskey despite the early hour. "Blair's released Archie," Jimmy announced. Dropping into a chair. Turns out his alibi's solid. The pub landlord confirmed he was hiding in the cellar from 7:30 until closing time. Too many witnesses. Hamish poured them both a dram. So who's Blair's new favourite suspect? "That's why I'm here," said Jimmy grimly. "He's found 2 more. Dr. Brodie and some nephew of the victim who's turned up from Edinburgh. Tell me about the nephew. Callum Vane, 28, professional gambler and general wastrel, showed up at the Strathbane station this morning demanding to know when he can claim his inheritance. Turns out Julian Vane was his only living relative. The young man the Curry twins saw arguing with Vane," said Hamish. "The very same. Blair's in heaven. Angry relative with money troubles arrives the day of the murder. It's practically gift-wrapped. What about Dr. Brodie?" Jimmy consulted his notebook. Apparently Vane was threatening to report him to the medical board over some old mistake. Nothing serious. A misdiagnosis from years back that didn't result in any real harm. But Vane was using it as leverage. Leverage for what? Jimmy shrugged. Blair doesn't care about details like that. He just knows Brodie had a motive and can't account for his whereabouts between 8 and 9 last night. Where was he? Claims he was at home, reading. No witnesses except his wife. And Blair doesn't count spousal alibis. Hamish thought about the ledger entries he'd photographed. Both Dr. Brodie and Callum Vane were in there, their secrets neatly catalogued. But so were 24 other people, and not all of them had alibis. "I need to talk to both of them," he said. "Be my guest," said Jimmy. "Blair's got them cooling their heels at the station. He's planning to arrest one of them by end of day. Doesn't much matter which." Hamish drove to Strathbane with a sense of urgency. If Blair arrested the wrong person now, the real killer would have time to cover their tracks, assuming they hadn't already. He found Dr. Brodie in one of the interview rooms, looking tired and worried. The doctor was a solid man in his 60s, with kind eyes, and the sort of calm demeanour that came from years of dealing with medical emergencies. "Constable Macbeth," he said with evident relief. "Perhaps you can talk some sense into that Blair fellow. I didn't kill Julian Vane." "Tell me about the medical board threat," said Hamish. Dr. Brodie sighed. "It was nothing, really. Years ago I misdiagnosed a case of appendicitis as gastritis. The patient recovered fine after emergency surgery, but Vane somehow dug up the records. He said he'd report me unless I paid him £5,000. Did you pay him?" "I was considering it. The shame of it, Hamish, after 40 years of practice, to be threatened with professional disgrace over one mistake. Where were you last night between 8 and 9? At home with my wife. We were playing cards with Reverend Wellington until midnight. He left around 7:30, and then Margaret and I just stayed in. The weather was foul." Hamish made a note. The timeline was tight, but not impossible. The manse was only 10 minutes from the bridge. Brodie could have left his wife briefly, committed the murder, and returned without her noticing. But somehow Hamish didn't think he had. Doctor. Yeah, Brodie was the sort of man who would have paid the blackmail rather than resort to violence. It was the easier path, and doctors generally preferred easier paths. He found Callum Vane in another interview room, and the family resemblance was immediately apparent. Same sharp features, same arrogant set to the jaw. But where Julian had worn expensive country tweeds, Callum was dressed in flashy city clothes that had seen better days. "So you're the famous Highland detective," Callum said with a sneer. "The one who's too lazy to catch criminals." Hamish ignored the jibe. "Tell me about your uncle." "What's to tell? He was a bastard who made money ruining people's lives. The world's better off without him." "That's an interesting position for someone who stands to inherit his estate." Callum's expression flickered. "I'm not pretending to mourn him. We hadn't spoken in 5 years. But I didn't kill him. You were seen arguing with him yesterday afternoon. We were discussing my inheritance. He said he was changing his will, cutting me out entirely. Said I was a disgrace to the family name." Callum laughed bitterly. This from a man who blackmailed people for a living? So you had a strong motive. I had a motive to keep him alive, not kill him. If he died before changing his will, I inherit everything. If I'd wanted him dead, I would have waited until after he'd changed it and then been grateful. The logic was sound, Hamish had to admit. "What time did you leave Lochdoub?" "Around 4 o'clock. I drove straight back to Edinburgh. You can check the traffic cameras on the A9. "We will," said Hamish. "And did your uncle say anything during your argument about what he was doing in Lochdoub?" "Just that he was working on some land deal. Said it was going to make him a fortune. He seemed excited about it, actually. Said he'd found something in the old records that would set him up for life." "Did he say what?" "No. I told him I didn't care about his sordid business dealings and left." Hamish studied the young man. Callum Vane was clearly a wastrel and probably a liar. But that didn't make him a murderer. And if the traffic cameras confirmed his alibi, he couldn't have been at the bridge when his uncle died. Back at the Strathbane station, Hamish found Jimmy at his desk. "Traffic cameras show Callum Vane's car on the A9 at 8:15, Jimmy said without preamble. "No way he could have been in Lochdoub at the time of death. So we can rule him out. Blair's not happy about it. He's putting all his money on Dr. Brodie now." "What about the Reverend Wellington? Did anyone confirm his story about the card game?" Jimmy nodded. "I spoke to him myself this morning. Confirms he was at the Brodie's house until 7:30. Said they played three-handed whist." "Three-handed? Aye." "Mrs. Brodie, the Reverend, and the Doctor." The Reverend was quite specific about it, so if Brodie left to commit murder, the Reverend would have noticed. Exactly, which means Brodie's alibi is solid. Jimmy leaned back in his chair. That's 3 suspects cleared: Archie, Callum, and now Dr. Brodie. Blair's running out of people to arrest. Hamish thought about the ledger, still hidden in Vane's cottage safe. There were plenty of other names in there, plenty of other people with motives. But most of them were simple folk with simple secrets, the sort who would have paid blackmail rather than commit murder. Except for one person. Someone with the knowledge, the opportunity, and a secret that ran deeper than unpaid land taxes or old medical mistakes. Someone whose family had lost everything because of the Vane family, who had spent years waiting and planning. Someone who had hidden in plain sight, protected by a reputation for kindness. "What about Mrs. Menzies?" Hamish asked carefully. Has Blair looked into her background at all? Jimmy laughed. "The librarian?" "Hamish. She's the one helping us with the investigation. Blair thinks she's a saint." "Maybe that's the problem," said Hamish. He left Strathbane as the afternoon light began to fade, his mind turning over the problem. He needed more evidence before he could make any accusations. Mrs. Menzies was too well liked, too respected. If he was wrong, he'd destroy an innocent woman's reputation. If he was right, he needed to be absolutely certain. Back in Lochdew, he parked outside the library and sat watching the building. Through the windows, he could see Morag Menzies moving among the shelves, helping an elderly patron find a book. She looked so harmless, so gentle. But Hamish had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. The question was how to prove it. He needed to dig deeper into her past, into her family history. He needed to find the connection between Malcolm Menzies and the present day. And he needed to do it without alerting her to his suspicions. Because if Mrs. Menzies was the killer, she'd already proven herself capable of cold-blooded murder. And Hamish had no intention of becoming her second victim. Chapter 6. False Trails and Poached Fish. Hamish woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of someone moving around outside the police station. He lay still for a moment, listening. Lugs raised his head and gave a low growl, which meant it wasn't anyone the dog recognised. Moving quietly, Hamish slipped out of bed and looked out the window. A figure was making its way across the moor towards Strathbane Bridge, carrying what looked like a heavy sack. Even in the darkness, Hamish recognised the gate. Dr. Brodie. Hamish dressed quickly, grabbed his torch and followed at a distance. The doctor was moving with purpose, clearly familiar with the terrain despite the lack of moonlight. Hamish's mind raced. Had he been wrong about Brodie's alibi? Was the mild-mannered physician actually a killer, returning to the scene to dispose of evidence? The doctor made his way down to the riverbank beneath the bridge, the exact spot where Vane's body had been found. Hamish watched from above as Brodie knelt down and began digging with a small spade, the sack beside him. Hamish descended quietly, his hand on his torch, ready for confrontation. As he approached, he could hear the doctor muttering to himself. "Dr. Brodie," said Hamish quietly. The doctor jumped so violently he nearly fell into the river. "Hamish," he gasped, "you gave me a terrible fright. What are you doing here at 3 a.m? Dr. Brodie looked at the sack, then at Hamish, then back at the sack. His shoulders sagged in defeat. "I suppose I'd better show you." He opened the sack and Hamish shone his torch inside, expecting to see blood-stained clothes or the missing mobile phone or some other damning evidence of murder. Instead, he saw a large salmon, quite dead, wrapped in burlap. Hamish stared at it. "That's a fish." "Yes," said Dr. Brodie miserably. "A poached fish, to be precise. I caught it yesterday evening in Lord Strathmore's stream. I know I shouldn't have, but Margaret's been going on about fresh salmon for weeks, and I thought, just this once. So what are you doing burying it at 3 a.m? Dr. Brodie ran a hand through his hair. "Margaret found it this evening. She was furious. Said I was setting a bad example, that as a pillar of the community I couldn't be seen breaking the law. She made me promise to get rid of it where no one would find it. And you chose the murder scene? Well, the ground's already been disturbed here. I thought it would be easier to dig. The doctor looked utterly wretched. "I know how it looks, Hamish, but I swear on my medical degree this is all it is. One illegally caught salmon." Hamish considered the situation. In the strict letter of the law, poaching was theft. But in the Highlands, where everyone knew everyone and the old ways died hard, a blind eye was often turned to such minor transgressions. Lord Strathmore had more salmon than he knew what to do with, and Dr. Brodie had spent 40 years looking after the health of the village. "Put the fish back in the sack," said Hamish. "You're arresting me. I'm telling you to put the fish back in the sack and follow me." They walked in silence back to the police station, where Hamish made tea while Dr. Brodie sat looking like a man facing the gallows. "Right," said Hamish, handing him a cup. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to forget I saw you tonight. You're going to take that salmon home, cook it for your wife, and tell her it came from the fishmonger in Strathbane. But Hamish—" "And you're never going to poach another fish as long as you live," finished Hamish firmly. "Do we have an understanding?" Dr. Brodie's relief was palpable. "We do." "Thank you, Hamish. You're a good man." "I'm a lazy man who doesn't want the paperwork," said Hamish. "Now get out of here before I change my mind." After the doctor left, Hamish sat for a long time thinking. He'd been so certain that Brodie was up to something connected with the murder, but it had been nothing more than a middle-aged man trying to avoid his wife's wrath over a poached fish. It was a reminder that not every suspicious action was connected to the crime. People had their own secrets, their own small transgressions that had nothing to do with murder. The next morning, Hamish set about the task of verifying the other alibis more thoroughly. If he was going to build a case against Morag Menzies, he needed to be absolutely certain that no one else could have committed the crime. He started with Archie McLean, visiting the pub and confirming with the landlord that Archie had indeed been hiding in the cellar from 7:30 until well past closing time. "Aye," said the landlord. "His wife was on the warpath something fierce. He didn't dare show his face until she'd gone home. And you're certain about the time?" "Positive. He arrived just as the clock struck the half-hour. Because I remember thinking he was cutting it close. His wife was only 5 minutes behind him." Next, Hamish spoke with Reverend Wellington, a kindly man who wouldn't lie if his life depended on it. "Oh yes," the Reverend confirmed. "We played cards until quite late. I left the Brodies' house at 7:30 on the dot. I remember checking my watch because I wanted to be home before the rain got worse. And both Dr. and Mrs. Brodie were there the whole time, without question. We were in the middle of a hand when I left. They showed me to the door together. That confirmed Dr. Brodie's alibi completely. Even if he'd left immediately after the Reverend, he couldn't have made it to the bridge, committed the murder and returned home without his wife noticing his absence. Hamish drove out to check on some of the other names from the blackmail ledger, the ones who'd had arguments with Vane at the pub. One by one, he confirmed their whereabouts. The crofter had been dealing with a difficult carving. The shopkeeper had been at a birthday party in Strathbane with 40 witnesses. The fishmonger had been at home with his large, noisy family. By afternoon, Hamish had eliminated every obvious suspect, which left him with the uncomfortable truth he'd been avoiding. The only person with means, motive and opportunity was Morag Menzies. She had access to the murder weapon. She knew the bridge intimately, could navigate it in pitch darkness. She had a family history that gave her a powerful motive, and crucially, she had no alibi. She claimed to have been at home alone during the crucial hours, which was convenient and unprovable. But there was another piece to the puzzle that bothered Hamish. The killer had known exactly when and where to find Vane. They hadn't stumbled upon him by chance. It had been planned, precise, calculated. Which meant they'd either followed him to the bridge or arranged to meet him there. Hamish thought about Vane's missing mobile phone. If the killer had arranged a meeting by text or call, they would have wanted to dispose of that evidence. He returned to the murder scene one more time, searching more carefully than the forensics team had done. They'd been looking for obvious evidence. Hamish was looking for something specific. He found it 20 feet downstream, caught in the roots of a willow tree. The mobile phone, its screen cracked but still intact. Hamish carefully retrieved it and took it back to the police station. The phone was password protected, but Hamish tried the same combination that had opened the safe. 1847. The phone unlocked. He went straight to the text messages. The last one had been sent at 7:15 the previous evening, from a number Hamish didn't recognise. Meet me at the bridge at 8. I have information about the Menzies land claim. Come alone. Hamish felt his heart rate quicken. This was it. Proof that Vane had been lured to his death. He checked the call log and found the same number had called Vane twice that afternoon. He copied the number and called Jimmy Anderson. "Can you trace a mobile number for me?" Jimmy called back 20 minutes later. "It's a pay-as-you-go phone," he said. "Bought for cash at a shop in Strathbane 3 days ago. No way to trace it to a specific person." "Of course not," said Hamish. The killer had been careful, but they'd made one mistake. They'd mentioned the Menzies land claim specifically. How many people in Loch-Dubh would even know about that? Only someone with access to the historical records. Someone who spent their days surrounded by old documents and property deeds. Someone like the village librarian. Hamish sat back and looked at Luggs, who was watching him with his usual patient expression. "I think I know who did it," he said aloud. But knowing and proving are two different things. He needed physical evidence. Something that would tie Morag Menzies directly to the crime. The text message wasn't enough. Any good lawyer could argue that someone else had sent it using the Menzies name as a false trail. He needed to search the library, but he couldn't do it officially. Blair would never authorise a search warrant based on Hamish's intuition, which meant he'd have to do it the old-fashioned way, quietly, unofficially, and without telling anyone. Hamish Macbeth was about to break into the village library, and he could only hope that what he found there would justify the risk. Chapter 7. Ironclad Alibis. Morag Menzies settled herself in the chair across from Hamish's desk with the air of someone who had nothing to hide. She accepted his offer of tea and sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, the picture of respectable middle-aged propriety. "I've been going through the library records," she said, pulling a small notebook from her handbag. "I thought it might help to know which documents Mr. Vane was most interested in during his visits." "That's very thorough of you," said Hamish, watching her carefully. "Well, I do like to be helpful," she smiled. The poor man was quite obsessed with property transfers from the 1840s, kept asking about the Menzies family holdings. I told him the records were incomplete. There was a fire in the old courthouse, you see, back in the 1860s. So much was lost. "The Menzies family," said Hamish. "Any relation to you?" Her expression didn't change. "Oh, it's a common enough name in the Highlands, Constable. Half of Sutherland is named Menzies," she laughed lightly. "Though I suppose I might have some distant connection. My mother's people came from up that way." "Where exactly in Sutherland?" "Near Tongue, I think." But she never talked much about it. There was some family unpleasantness, the sort of thing people preferred to forget. Hamish made a show of writing in his notebook. "And where were you on the night Mr. Vane died?" "Between 8 and 10 o'clock. At home, reading. I live alone, as you know, so I'm afraid I can't provide a witness." She tilted her head. "Is that a problem?" "It's routine," said Hamish. "We're asking everyone." "Of course." She stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Well, if there's nothing else, I should get back to the library. Thursday is Pensioners' Day, and they do like their large print mysteries." After she left, Hamish sat for a long time, staring at the notes she'd provided. Everything she'd said was perfectly reasonable, perfectly helpful. And yet something about the conversation bothered him. She'd volunteered information about the Menzies family before he'd really pressed her on it. Almost as if she wanted to control the narrative, to present her version of the facts before he could discover them himself. He needed to verify the alibis properly, all of them, not just take people's word for it. Hamish spent the afternoon methodically working through the suspect list. Archie McLean's alibi was solid. The pub landlord confirmed he'd been hiding in the cellar from 7:30 until closing time, afraid to face his wife. Multiple witnesses corroborated the story. Callum Vane was definitively ruled out by the traffic cameras. He'd been 50 miles away at the time of death driving back to Edinburgh. There was no way he could have been at the bridge. Dr. Brodie's alibi was trickier. Hamish drove out to the manse and found Reverend Wellington in his study, working on Sunday's sermon. The minister confirmed the card game. Arrived at the Brodies' house at 6 o'clock, he said. Margaret, the doctor, and myself. We played until 7:30, and Dr. Brodie was there the entire time. The Reverend frowned. Well, now that you mention it, he did step out once, said he needed to check on something in the garage. But he was only gone a few minutes. What time was this? Around 7 o'clock, I'd say. Just after we finished the first round of whist. A few minutes. That wasn't nearly enough time to get to the bridge, commit murder, and return. Hamish thanked the Reverend and crossed Dr. Brodie off his mental list. He called Jimmy Anderson. What about the forensics from the bridge? Any fingerprints on the murder weapon? Wiped clean, said Jimmy. Whoever did this was careful. No prints on the peat cutter, none on the stone markers that were disturbed. We did find some fabric fibres caught on the bridge railing. Dark wool, probably from a coat or cardigan. Half the village wears dark wool, said Hamish. Aye, that's the problem. And the rain washed away most of the useful evidence. No footprints. No trace evidence except those archival paper fibres we already knew about. Hamish hung up, feeling frustrated. Every lead seemed to go nowhere. Every suspect had either a solid alibi or insufficient evidence to proceed. Except for Morag Menzies, who had no alibi at all and had admitted to being alone all evening. That night, Hamish sat in his kitchen with his notes spread across the table. Lugs lay at his feet, and Sonsi was curled up on the windowsill, both animals sensing their master's preoccupation. The problem was motive and opportunity. Morag had the opportunity, being alone and unaccounted for. But proving the motive meant proving the family connection, proving that Vane had threatened her with exposure, and even if Hamish could prove both those things, it still wasn't enough for an arrest. Blair would laugh him out of Strathbane. The kindly librarian as a cold-blooded killer. He'd need concrete evidence. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. It was Jimmy Anderson, and he sounded excited. Hamish. We found Vane's mobile phone. It was in the river, downstream from the bridge. The tech boys managed to recover some of the data. And text messages. Vane sent one at 7:45 on the night he died. To an unknown number, it says, "I'll be at the bridge at 8. Come alone and we'll discuss terms." Did they trace the number? Pay-as-you-go mobile. Untraceable. But the tech boys found something else. Vane took a photograph at 7:30 that evening. It's a bit waterlogged, but you can make out what it is. What? A piece of jewellery. Old Victorian era by the look of it. A brooch with what looks like garnets. Why, there's a note with the photo. Found where you said. Proof you were telling the truth. Hamish's pulse quickened. The hidden family artefacts. Vane had found them. Is there anything else? One more thing. Draft email in his sent folder from that afternoon. To someone called Subject Line. We need to talk about your family's property. Just the initial M. That's all. But Hamish, there's only one M in your suspect pool, and that's Morag Menzies, Hamish finished. He sat back, his mind racing. Vane had found the hidden artefacts and contacted Morag about her family's property. He had arranged to meet her at the bridge at 8 o'clock, and sometime during that meeting Morag had killed him. But had she planned it in advance, or had it been a moment of rage? Had she brought the peat cutter with her? Or had she seized it in the heat of the moment? The next morning Hamish drove to the library with a new purpose. He needed to search Morag's office, but he needed a legitimate reason that wouldn't alert her to his suspicions. He found her shelving books in the history section. Mrs. Menzies, I need to look through the property records for the 1840s, the ones Vane was researching. Blair's demanding a full report on what he was investigating. Of course, she said immediately. I'll get you the keys to the archive room. It's all rather dusty, I'm afraid. We don't get many researchers asking for documents that old. She led him to a small room at the back of the library, lined with filing cabinets and old ledgers. As she unlocked the door, Hamish noticed her hands were steady, her manner calm. "I'll leave you to it," she said. "Just lock up when you're finished." Hamish waited until she'd gone, then began his search. He found the property records easily enough. The Menzies family sale was documented in faded ink, the signatures barely legible. Malcolm Menzies had sold the land for a fraction of its value, clearly desperate for cash. But what caught Hamish's attention was a small notation in the margin, in much more recent handwriting. It read, "Check Bridge Foundation, East Side, 3 stones down." The handwriting was neat and precise, Morag's handwriting if Hamish was any judge. She'd known where the artefacts were hidden. She'd told Vane, probably thinking she could trust him to keep the secret. But Vane had seen an opportunity for blackmail instead. Hamish photographed the notation and continued searching. In one of the filing cabinets, he found a file marked Personal Research. Inside were copies of old newspaper articles about Malcolm Menzies' bankruptcy and subsequent suicide. There were also genealogy records carefully traced, showing Morag's direct descent from Malcolm. She'd known all along who she was. She'd spent 30 years in Lochdu, living quietly, waiting for something, for justice, for revenge, or simply for someone to acknowledge what had been stolen from her family. And then Julian Vane had arrived, with his arrogant threats and his blackmail schemes, and Morag had finally snapped. Hamish locked the archive room and returned the keys to Morag's desk. She was still shelving books, humming quietly to herself. "Thank you, Mrs. Menzies. Very helpful. Did you find what you needed?" Hamish looked at her carefully. "I think so." As he walked back to the police station, Hamish felt the weight of what he knew. The evidence was mounting, but it was still largely circumstantial. A family connection, a suspicious notation in an old ledger, text messages to an unknown number. He needed something more. Something that would prove beyond doubt that Morag Menzies had been at that bridge, had struck down Julian Vane with cold calculation. And he needed to find it before Blair arrested someone else, or before Morag realised how close Hamish was to the truth. Because if she was capable of one murder, she might well be capable of another. Chapter 8. The Librarian's Flaw. Hamish spent the next 2 days building his case with the patience of a man who knew that rushing would only alert his quarry. He requested the phone records from the untraceable mobile that had received Vane's text message. The company confirmed the phone had been purchased for cash at a shop in Strathbane 3 weeks earlier. No name, no records, impossible to trace to a buyer. But the timing was interesting. 3 weeks ago, just before Julian Vane had arrived in Lochdu, someone had known he was coming, someone had prepared. Hamish pulled out the timeline that Morag had provided to Blair on the morning after the murder. It was neatly written, detailing every interaction Vane had with the villagers, every threat he'd made, every person he'd offended. Too neat, perhaps. Too convenient. Hamish examined it more closely, comparing it against the statements he'd collected independently. Most of it checked out. Vane had indeed threatened Archie at the pub. He had indeed spoken rudely to the Curry twins. He had indeed made enemies. But there was one entry that caught Hamish's attention. According to Morag's timeline, Vane had spent 2 hours at the library on the afternoon before his death, researching a specific land deed from 1847. Hamish had checked the library's sign-in book himself. Vane's last visit had been 3 days before his death, not the afternoon before, and the deed Morag claimed he'd been researching had been destroyed in the courthouse fire of 1863. Morag couldn't possibly have shown it to him because it didn't exist, which meant she'd lied. A small lie, perhaps, but a telling one. She'd invented a research session to explain why Vane might have been interested in the bridge, to provide a plausible reason for him to be there that night. But in doing so, she'd made a mistake. She'd referenced a document that she, as the village historian, should have known was destroyed. It was the sort of error a guilty person might make when constructing an alibi. A tiny flaw in an otherwise perfect performance. Hamish called Jimmy Anderson. "I need you to do something for me, and you can't tell Blair." Jimmy sighed. "What is it this time?" "I need you to get a warrant for Mrs. Menzies' cottage, but quietly. Don't execute it yet, just have it ready. The librarian." "Hamish, Blair will never authorise that. He thinks she's the Virgin Mary incarnate. That's why you're going to get Judge Morrison to sign it. And tell him I have evidence linking her to the murder, but I need the warrant in place before I make my move." "What evidence?" Hamish ran through what he had. The family connection, the handwritten notation in the library records, the timeline discrepancy, the untraceable phone purchased just before Vane's arrival. "It's all circumstantial," Jimmy said doubtfully. "I know. But there's something else. I think she left evidence at her cottage. Something that will tie her directly to the crime scene." "What sort of evidence?" "The murder weapon was wiped clean, but the killer would have had blood on their clothes, and Morag lives alone. If she killed Vane, she would have taken the clothes home to dispose of them. She wouldn't have risked burning them where someone might see the smoke. So you think they're still there? I think it's worth looking. And I think we need to move before she realises how close we are." Jimmy was silent for a moment. "All right, I'll get the warrant. But Hamish, if you're wrong about this, Blair will have both our heads." "I'm not wrong," said Hamish. He spent the rest of the day reviewing everything he knew. The pieces were fitting together now, forming a picture of premeditated murder disguised as opportunity. Morag had known Vane was coming to investigate the bridge. She'd bought an untraceable phone to communicate with him without leaving a trail. When Vane had discovered the hidden artifacts and realised their significance, he'd contacted her. But instead of being grateful for the discovery of her family's lost property, Vane had seen an opportunity for extortion. The artifacts had been hidden by Malcolm Menzies to keep them from his creditors, which made them legally questionable. If Morag tried to claim them now, Vane could report the original theft. Her reputation would be destroyed. So Vane had demanded payment for his silence, and Morag, after 30 years of quiet rage over her family's treatment, had decided that some debts could only be settled in blood. That evening, Hamish returned to the bridge one more time. He wanted to understand exactly how the murder had happened, to visualise the sequence of events. He stood where Vane must have stood, near the east support beam, looking down at the stones where the artefacts had been hidden. It was an isolated spot, invisible from the road, perfect for a private meeting. Morag would have arrived first, probably. She'd have brought the peat cutter with her, hidden in a bag or wrapped in cloth. When Vane turned to examine the hiding place, she'd struck from behind. One blow, precise and powerful, delivered with all the rage of a woman who'd spent decades waiting for justice. Then she'd wiped the weapon clean, disturbed the stone markers to make it look like Vane had been searching for something, and slipped away into the darkness. The rain had washed away her footprints, and her reputation for kindness had protected her from suspicion. It was almost perfect, except for the small mistakes, the timeline discrepancy, the too helpful provision of evidence against other suspects, the fact that she'd inserted herself into the investigation so thoroughly that she'd actually drawn attention to herself. Hamish climbed back up to the bridge and leaned against the stone railing, thinking. He needed one more piece of evidence, something irrefutable that would convince even Blair. He was still standing there when he heard footsteps behind him. Constable Macbeth! He turned to find Morag Menzies approaching through the gathering dusk. She was carrying her ever-present basket covered with a tea towel. "Mrs. Menzies," said Hamish, keeping his voice neutral. "What brings you out here?" "I saw your Land Rover from the road," she said. "I thought you might like some supper. You work such long hours. That's kind of you." She set the basket down on the bridge wall and looked out over the water. "It's peaceful here, isn't it? Despite what happened. You can almost forget that something terrible occurred on this very spot. Can you?" She smiled. "Well, perhaps not entirely. But life goes on, doesn't it? The village will recover. It always does." Hamish watched her carefully. "You've lived in Lochdoub a long time, haven't you? 30 years this autumn. And you've never mentioned that you have a family connection to this place, to this very bridge." Her smile didn't waver. "I told you, Constable. Menzies is a common name. Malcolm Menzies was your great-great-grandfather. The smile faltered just for a moment. Who told you that? The genealogy records in your personal files. The ones in the library archive. Morag was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. The soft, helpful tone was gone, replaced by something harder. You've been busy, Constable, just doing my job. She turned to face him fully, and in the fading light, Hamish could see a different woman than the one he'd thought he knew. The gentle librarian was gone. In her place stood someone tired and angry and utterly unrepentant. Malcolm Menzies owned this land, she said quietly. His family had owned it for 3 generations, and Julian Vane's father destroyed him with a fraudulent business deal, stole everything, and left him to die in poverty and shame. That was a long time ago. Does injustice have an expiration date, Constable? She laughed bitterly. I spent 30 years researching what happened to my family, 30 years discovering exactly how the Vanes built their fortune on the ruins of honest people. And then Julian Vane arrived here, doing the same thing his father did, threatening, extorting, destroying lives for profit. So you killed him. Morag didn't answer directly. She reached into her basket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. Do you know what this is? She unwrapped it carefully. It was a Victorian brooch, garnet set in gold. The same brooch from the photograph on Vane's phone. It was my great-great-grandmother's, Morag said. One of the few things Malcolm managed to hide before the creditors took everything, and Julian Vane found it. He was going to keep it as payment for his silence, payment for not reporting that my ancestor had hidden family property from his creditors. Hamish took a step closer. Mrs. Menzies, I think we should go to the station and discuss this properly. She looked at him with something like pity. You're a good man, Hamish Macbeth. Too good for this job. Too good for this world, perhaps. You actually care about justice. Justice isn't murder, isn't it? She slipped the brooch back into her basket. What would you call it when a family's destroyed by fraud and lies? When a man takes his own life because everything he loved was stolen from him? Where was the justice for Malcolm Menzies? Where was the justice for his widow, who died in a poorhouse? Where was the justice for their daughter, my great-grandmother, who was sent to the workhouse at age 12? There are legal channels, Morag laughed, a harsh sound in the twilight. Legal channels. The same legal channels that allowed the Vanes to steal in the first place. No, Constable. Sometimes justice requires a more direct approach. Hamish reached for his radio, but Morag shook her head. Don't worry, I'm not going to run. Where would I go? This village is my home. This bridge is my heritage. She looked out over the water again. I've waited 30 years. I can wait a bit longer. In the distance, Hamish heard the sound of vehicles approaching. Jimmy Anderson, arriving with the warrant and backup. Morag heard it too. She smiled, and for a moment Hamish saw the gentle librarian again. You worked it out, she said approvingly. I knew you would. You're cleverer than you pretend to be. The vehicles pulled up and Jimmy emerged with 2 uniformed officers. Hamish nodded to them. Mrs. Morag Menzies, he said formally, I'm arresting you for the murder of Julian Vane. And as the officers led her away, Morag looked back once at the bridge, at the land her family had lost, and smiled. Chapter 9. Sins of the Past. The interview room at Strathbane police station was depressingly familiar to Hamish. He'd sat in this same chair countless times, watching Blair bungle interrogations with his usual combination of bluster and incompetence. But this time was different. This time Blair wasn't running the show. Morag Menzies sat across from him, her hands folded neatly on the table, her expression calm. She'd refused a solicitor, much to Blair's delight. The detective chief inspector was convinced she'd confess within the hour, and he could claim credit for solving the case. Hamish knew better. Morag would confess when she was ready, and not a moment before. She'd already been cautioned, the tape recorder was running, and Jimmy Anderson sat beside Hamish, notebook at the ready. Blair stood in the corner, arms crossed, or looking like a self-satisfied toad. Mrs. Menzies, Hamish began, his voice gentle. "Tell us about Malcolm Menzies." Morag's eyes flickered with something that might have been surprise. "Not about Julian Vane. Not about the night of the murder. We'll get to that. First, I want to understand what happened to your family." Blair made an impatient noise, but Jimmy shot him a warning look. Hamish had a way with suspects that Blair would never understand. Sometimes you had to let them tell their story. Morag was quiet for a long moment. Then she began to speak, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting a tale passed down through generations. "Malcolm Menzies was born in 1823, she said. He inherited land near what's now Strathbane Bridge from his father. Good land, fertile and well-positioned. He built a successful business selling wool and cattle. He married, had a daughter. They were prosperous, respected. What happened? In 1846, a London businessman approached him about a joint venture. A new railway line through the Highlands. The businessman's name was Edward Vane. Julian Vane's grandfather? Great-grandfather, actually. Morag's voice hardened. Edward Vane convinced Malcolm to invest everything in the railway scheme. Showed him fraudulent documents. Promised returns that would make the family wealthy for generations. Malcolm mortgaged his land, liquidated his assets, put every penny into the venture. Blair shifted impatiently. This is ancient history. Get to the murder. Hamish ignored him. And the railway scheme collapsed within a year. It had been a fraud from the beginning. Edward Vane disappeared with the money, leaving dozens of investors ruined. Malcolm lost everything. The creditors foreclosed on the land. His wife fell ill from the stress and poverty. She died in 1848. Malcolm hanged himself in the barn shortly after. "I'm sorry," said Hamish quietly. Their daughter, my great-grandmother, was 12 years old. She was sent to the workhouse in Inverness. She survived, barely. Grew up, married a fisherman, had children of her own. But the shame of it followed the family for generations. The Menzies name became synonymous with failure and disgrace. And you learned all this how? From my mother, on her deathbed. She told me the whole story, made me promise to find out the truth. So I spent years researching, following the paper trail. I discovered that Edward Vane had used the stolen money to establish a shipping company. That company grew, prospered, eventually became the business that Julian Vane inherited. She looked directly at Hamish. Everything the Vanes have, they built on the bones of my family and dozens of others, and they never paid for it. Edward Vane died wealthy and respected. His son died the same way. And Julian was following in their footsteps, using his position to extort and destroy, just like his ancestors. So you came to Loch Dubois to reclaim what was mine. The land where the bridge stands should have been my inheritance. I wanted to be close to it, to understand it. I became the village historian so I could access all the records, piece together exactly what had been stolen. And the hidden artifacts? Morag smiled faintly. That was my great-great-grandmother's doing. Before the creditors came, she hid a few pieces of jewellery near the bridge foundation. Family heirlooms that had belonged to her mother. She left a letter describing where they were hidden, but she died before she could retrieve them. The letter passed down through the family until it reached me. Did you recover them before Julian Vane arrived? No, I knew where they were, but I was afraid to disturb them, afraid someone would ask questions. She paused. Then Julian Vane came to Lochdoub with his surveys and his threats. He spent hours in the library researching the land deeds, and one day he found my genealogy notes. I'd been careless, left them in a folder with the other historical documents. He confronted you. He laughed at me. He said it was poetic justice that a Menzies was reduced to being a small-town librarian while the Vanes prospered. Then he offered me a deal. He'd retrieve the hidden jewellery for me, as proof that I was telling the truth about my heritage. But in exchange, I would pay him £5,000 for each piece. Otherwise he'd report the original concealment as theft and have me charged as an accessory. Blair snorted. So you killed him? Simple as that. Morag turned to look at him with contempt. Nothing about it was simple, Chief Inspector. I spent weeks deciding what to do. I even considered paying him. But then I realised he would never stop. Men like Julian Vane never stop. They take and take until there's nothing left. "So you planned the murder," said Hamish. "Yes. I bought an untraceable mobile phone to communicate with him. I told him I'd meet him at the bridge to discuss terms. I took the peat cutter from the heritage display the day before, hid it in my cottage, and on that night I went to the bridge prepared to end it." "Walk us through what happened," said Jimmy quietly. Morag's voice became distant, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. Julian arrived at 8 o'clock. It was raining heavily. He was excited, almost gleeful. He showed me the brooch he'd found, the one that had belonged to my great-great-grandmother. He held it up in the light and asked how much I thought it was worth. And then I asked him to show me exactly where he'd found it. He turned to point at the stones to explain the hiding place, and I struck him, one blow to the back of the head. He fell immediately. Hamish leaned forward. "How did you feel?" Morag met his gaze steadily, satisfied. For the first time in my life, I felt like justice had been done. Not legal justice, perhaps, but true justice. "What did you do after?" I wiped the peat cutter clean, threw it down beside the body to make it look like it had been dropped in the struggle. I disturbed the stone markers to suggest Julian had been searching for something. I took the brooch and his mobile phone. Then I walked home, in the rain. Yes. I was soaked through, but no one saw me. Everyone was inside, sheltering from the storm. I burned my clothes in my wood stove, buried the ashes in my garden the next morning. I kept the brooch. It belonged to my family, after all. And the phone? I threw it in the river the following night. I thought the water would destroy it completely. She smiled ruefully. "I underestimated modern technology." "You also underestimated me," said Hamish. Morag shook her head. "No, Constable. I knew you'd work it out eventually. You're the only one in this building with the wit to do so." She glanced at Blair with undisguised disdain. "I just hoped I'd have more time before you did." Blair's face turned purple. "You're confessing to premeditated murder. You'll spend the rest of your life in prison." "Perhaps," said Morag, "but Julian Vane is dead, and my family's honour is restored. That's all that matters." She looked at Hamish one last time. "You understand, don't you? You're a Highlander. You understand about family, about debts that span generations." Hamish thought about his own family, about the long Highland memory for wrongs both real and imagined. He did understand, which made it all the more tragic. "I understand," he said quietly. "But understanding doesn't make it right." Morag smiled. "No, but it makes it necessary." As the officers led her away to the cells, Hamish felt the familiar weight of solving a case. He'd found the truth, brought a killer to justice. But there was no satisfaction in it. Just the sad knowledge that sometimes the line between victim and villain was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Blair was already on the phone to his superiors, taking credit for the arrest. Jimmy caught Hamish's eye and shrugged. "You did good work," he said quietly. "Aye," said Hamish, "but good work doesn't always feel good." He left Strathbane as the evening light faded, driving back toward Lochdoub and the peaceful life he'd almost lost. Tomorrow Blair would hold a press conference. Tomorrow. The village would learn that their beloved librarian was a murderer. But tonight, Hamish just wanted to go home to Lugs and Sonsey, to his quiet croft house, to the simple pleasures of a life undisturbed by the complicated tangles of justice and revenge. The Highlands would remember this case for years to come, but Hamish Macbeth, as always, would try his best to forget. Chapter 10. The Lazy Constable's Justice. The library smelled of dust and old paper and the faint lavender scent that had always followed Morag Menzies. Hamish stood in the doorway, looking at the empty desk where she had sat for so many years, helping villagers find books and researching their family histories and quietly nursing her ancient grievance. The village council had asked him to collect her personal effects before they hired a replacement. It was the sort of task that fell to the local constable, tedious but necessary. He found her knitting bag tucked beneath the desk, exactly where she always kept it. Inside were the usual things: balls of wool in muted colours, knitting needles, a half-finished scarf, but tucked into the bottom, wrapped carefully in the tissue paper, was the Victorian brooch. The one that had belonged to her great-great-grandmother, the one Julian Vane had found hidden by the bridge. Hamish held it up to the light. Garnets and gold, beautiful in its way but hardly worth killing for. Except it wasn't about the monetary value. It was about what it represented: justice, heritage, the settling of old debts. He wrapped it carefully and slipped it into an evidence bag. Then, almost as an afterthought, he pulled out the other items from the knitting bag. More balls of wool, a pattern for a Fair Isle jumper, and at the very bottom a small bottle, archival glue, the same type that had left traces on Julian Vane's jacket. Hamish smiled grimly. Morag had kept it with her, probably without even thinking about it. A tiny piece of evidence that would seal the case beyond any doubt. He added it to the evidence bag. The door opened behind him, and Blair waddled in, his face flushed with self-importance. "There you are, Macbeth. I've been looking for you. The press conference is in an hour. I want you there, standing in the background looking official." "I'd rather not, sir," said Hamish mildly. It wasn't a request. Blair's eyes narrowed. "This is a major case. High-profile murder solved by brilliant detective work. You'll be there to show that even backwater constables can contribute when properly supervised." Hamish suppressed a sigh. He knew what was coming. Blair would take full credit for the arrest, would spin a tale of his own investigative genius, would make sure everyone knew that lazy Hamish Macbeth had been little more than a bystander. Which was exactly what Hamish wanted. "Of course, sir," he said. "Whatever you think best." Blair looked suspicious. Hamish's easy compliance always made him wary, but the lure of public acclaim was too strong to resist. "Right then, 1 hour. Don't be late." After Blair left, Hamish finished collecting Morag's belongings. He found her research files, the genealogy records that traced her family back to Malcolm Menzies. He found newspaper clippings about the railway fraud, about Edward Vane's business empire, about the long shadow of Victorian-era corruption. And he found something else. A letter, unsealed, addressed to him. He opened it and read Morag's neat handwriting. "Dear Constable Macbeth, if you're reading this, then you've worked it out just as I knew you would. I want you to know that I don't regret what I did. Julian Vane was a monster, just like his ancestors. The world is better without him. Mate, I also want you to know that I placed the archival glue in my knitting bag deliberately. I wanted you to find it, to have the evidence you needed for a conviction. I won't have some clever solicitor getting me off on a technicality. What I did with full knowledge and intent. I deserve to face the consequences, but I hope you'll understand why it had to be done. Some debts can only be settled in blood. Some wrongs are too great to forgive. Thank you for treating me with dignity during the investigation. You're a good man, Hamish Macbeth. Don't let them promote you. You belong in Lochdub. Yours, Morag Menzies." Hamish folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Even in confession, even facing life imprisonment, Morag had been thinking clearly, making sure all the loose ends were tied up. The press conference was exactly as awful as Hamish had anticipated. Blair stood before the cameras, his chest puffed out like a rooster, spinning a tale of brilliant detective work and dogged determination. "From the moment I arrived at the scene," Blair announced, "I knew this was no ordinary case. The placement of the body, the choice of weapon, all suggested a calculated killer with intimate knowledge of the area." In the background, Hamish stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his face carefully neutral. Jimmy Anderson stood beside him, trying not to laugh. Through meticulous investigation and psychological profiling, Blair continued, "I was able to narrow the suspect pool to the most unlikely candidate. A pillar of the community, trusted by all, but hiding a dark secret. He's laying it on a bit thick," Jimmy whispered. "Aye," said Hamish. But let him have his moment. The reporters asked questions, and Blair answered them all with increasing grandiosity. Yes, He had personally discovered the evidence linking Mrs. Menzies to the crime. Yes, he had conducted the interrogation that led to her confession. Yes, the case demonstrated the importance of experienced detectives who weren't fooled by appearances. Through it all, Hamish stood silent, content to be overlooked. After the conference, Blair cornered him in the hallway. "You were quiet in there, Macbeth. Nothing to add, sir. You covered everything perfectly." Blair's eyes narrowed. "You're not going to cause trouble? Try to claim credit?" Hamish looked shocked. "Of course not, sir. It was your investigation. I just helped with the minor details." Blair seemed satisfied with that. "Good. Because I've been thinking about your future, Macbeth. This case shows you need proper supervision. I'm recommending you stay in Lockdube indefinitely. Can't have you transferred to Strathbane, where you might get ideas above your station." Hamish felt a wave of relief so profound he almost smiled. "That's very thoughtful of you, sir." "Yes. Well," Blair straightened his tie, "someone has to keep an eye on you lazy Highlanders." After Blair left, Jimmy clapped Hamish on the shoulder. "You did that on purpose. Let him take all the credit so he'd keep you in Lockdube." Hamish smiled innocently. "I don't know what you mean. You're a canny bastard, Hamish Macbeth. I'm just a lazy village constable who wants a quiet life." Jimmy laughed. "Aye, and I'm the Queen of Sheba." Hamish drove back to Lockdube as the sun began to set over the highlands. The village looked peaceful in the golden light, smoke rising from chimneys, the harbour calm and still. He parked outside the police station and sat for a moment, listening to the silence. No more murder investigation, no more late nights piecing together evidence, no more confrontations with killers at lonely bridges. Just the quiet rhythm of village life, which was exactly what he wanted. Lugs greeted him at the door with enthusiastic tail wagging, and Sonsy wound around his ankles, purring. Hamish fed them both, then made himself a cup of tea and settled into his armchair by the fire. The case was closed. Morag Menzies would spend the rest of her life in prison for a murder she didn't regret. Julian Vane was dead, and perhaps the world was no worse for it. Blair had his glory and Hamish had his peaceful village posting. It wasn't perfect justice. But then, Hamish had learned long ago that perfect justice was rare in this world. Sometimes you had to settle for the best you could manage. He pulled out the letter Morag had left him and read it one more time. Then he fed it into the fire and watched it burn. Outside, the Highland night settled over Lockdube like a blessing. The bridge still stood, ancient and solid, connecting past to present, spanning the river that had witnessed so much history. And in his Croft House police station, Hamish Macbeth shared a piece of shortbread with his dog and his wild cat, content that the delicate balance of his beloved village had been restored. Tomorrow, someone would come to interview for the librarian position. Tomorrow, the village would begin the slow process of healing. Tomorrow, life would go on. But tonight, Hamish was content to sit by his fire and be grateful for the things that mattered. Peace, quiet, a roof over his head and animals at his feet. The simple pleasures of a lazy Highland constable who had once again solved a murder without anyone noticing how clever he'd been. Which was exactly the way Hamish Macbeth liked it. The end.